Hey, hi, hello there, and welcome back to Formula Amateur, where today we are talking about all things World Championships in terms of constructors. So we are talking about the last however many years, 60 plus years, since 1958, when the World Constructors Championship had started. Who were the teams? Who were the drivers for those teams that won it? And at the end, we'll also talk about how many of these teams have received multiple championships from the bottom to the top. We'll get there. Stick around and let's find out together, shall we? So last week we spoke about the champions, the individual champions, the drivers who have won the World Drivers' Championship title. This week we are talking about the Constructors' Champions, which is the team's championship, and the Constructors' Championship is awarded to the team with the most points scored, either at the point when it is mathematically impossible to outscore them, or who finished the season with the most points. This has only been awarded since 1958, so it hasn't been going as long as the World Drivers' Championship. And I hope you haven't been counting how many times I said championship in that statement. But let's get on to all the teams, when they won it, and what they were called, because a lot has changed since 1958. Okay, so let's start off in the 1950s. So in the 1950s, there were only two constructors, because the constructors title, as I mentioned, only started in 1958. But in 1958, it was Van Wall, and their drivers that year were Sterling Moss, Tony Brooks, Stuart Lewis Evans. And then in 1959, it was Cooper with Jack Brabham, Sterling Moss and Bruce McLaren. Okay, so now we get into the first proper decade of the championship. So in 1960 it was Cooper with Jack Brabham and Bruce McLaren. Then in 61 it was Ferrari with Phil Hill and Wolfgang von Trips. In 62 it was BRM with Graham Hill, Richie Ginther and Bruce Johnstone. In 63 it was Lotus with Jim Clark, Trevor Taylor, Peter Arundel, Mike Spence, Pedro Rodriguez. In 64 it was Ferrari with John Surtees and Lorenzo Bandini. In 65 it was a Lotus with Jim Clark, Mark Spence, Gerard Mitter, Gecki, Moises Solana. In 66 it was Brabham with Jack Brabham, Denny Hulme and Chris Irwin. In 67 it was Brabham with Jack Brabham and Denny Hulme. In 68 it was Lotus with Graham Hill, Joe Siffert, Jim Clark, Jackie Oliver, Mario Andretti, Bill Brack and Moises Solana. And in 69 it was Matra with Jackie Stewart, Jean-Pierre Bertois and Johnny Servus Gavin. Now, there might be some drivers missing from this list that took part in driving for these teams, as in those times a lot of drivers took one seat in just one or two races, so I do apologise for any that are missing. And now let's go into the 70s. So the 70s were looking like this. In 1970 it was Lotus with Johan Rindt, Emerson Fittipaldi, Graham Hill, John Miles, Alex Soler-Roig and René Whistle. In 71 it was Tyrrell with Jackie Stewart, Francois Sever and Peter Revson. In 72 it was Lotus with Emerson Fittipaldi, David Walker and René Whistle. In 73 it was Lotus with Emerson Fittipaldi and Ronnie Peterson. In 74 it was McLaren with Emerson Fittipaldi, Denny Hulme, Mike Hellwood, David Hobbs and Johan Mess. In 75 it was Ferrari with Clay Regazzoni and Niki Lauda. In 76 it was Ferrari with Clay Regazzoni, Niki Lauda and Carlos Reutemann. In 77 it was Ferrari with Niki Lauda, Carlos Reutemann and Gilles Villeneuve. In 78 it was Lotus with Mario Andretti, Ronnie Peterson and Jean-Pierre Jarier. And in 79 it was Ferrari with Jody Scheckter and Gilles Villeneuve. So now on to the 80s, where in 1980 it was Williams with Alan Jones and Carlos Reutemann. In 81 it was Williams with Alan Jones and Carlos Rotman again. In 82 it was Ferrari with Gilles Villeneuve, Didier Pironi, Patrick Tambay and Mario Andretti. In 83 it was Ferrari with Patrick Tambay and Rene Arnaud. In 84 it was McLaren with Alain Prost and Niki Lauda. In 85 it was McLaren with Niki Lauda, Alain Prost and John Watson. In 86 it was Williams with Nigel Mansell and Nelson Piquet Sr. In 87 it was Williams with Nigel Mansell, Nelson Piquet Sr. and Riccardo Patrese. In 88 it was McLaren with Alain Prost and Ayrton Senna. In 89 it was McLaren with Alain Prost and Ayrton Senna. And now we go into the 90s. So the 90s come calling, and who do we have in 1990? Well, we have McLaren with Ayrton Senna and Gerhard Berger. In 91 it was McLaren with Ayrton Senna and Gerhard Berger again. In 92 it was Williams with Nigel Mansell and Riccardo Patrese. In 94 it was Williams with Damon Hill, Ayrton Senna, David Coulthard, Nigel Mansell. In 95 it was Benetton with Michael Schumacher and Johnny Herbert. In 96 it was Williams with Damon Hill and Jacques Villeneuve. In 97 it was Williams with Jacques Villeneuve and Heinz-Harald Frentzen. In 98 it was McLaren with David Coulthard and Mika Hakkinen. In 99 it was Ferrari with Michael Schumacher, Eddie Irvine and Mika Salo. So now we go into the 2000s, where in 2000 it was Ferrari with Michael Schumacher and Rubens Barrichello, and in 2001 it was Ferrari with Michael Schumacher and Rubens Barrichello again, and then in 2002 it was Michael Schumacher and Rubens Barrichello for Ferrari yet again, and in 2003, guess what, Ferrari, Michael Schumacher, Rubens Barrichello. In 2004, Ferrari, Michael Schumacher, Rubens Barrichello, and then in 2005 was Renault with Fernando Alonso and Giancarlo Fisichella, and in 2006 it was Renault with Fernando Alonso and Giancarlo Fisichella again, and then in 2007 it was Ferrari with Felipe Massa and Kimi Raikkonen, and in 2008 it was the final time so far that Ferrari has been world champions, and that was in 2008, Ferrari, Felipe Massa and Kimi Raikkonen, and then in 2009 it was Brawn with Jenson Button and Rubens Barrichello. So now we go into the 2010s, where in 2010 it was Red Bull with Sebastian Vettel and Mark Webber. In 2011 it was Red Bull with Sebastian Vettel and Mark Webber. In 2012 it was Red Bull with Sebastian Vettel and Mark Webber, and in 2013 it was Sebastian Vettel and Mark Webber for Red Bull yet again, and then in 2014 it was Mercedes with Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg. In 2015 it was Mercedes with Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg, and in 2016 it was Mercedes with Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg, and then in 2017 it was Mercedes with Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas. In 2018 it was Mercedes with Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas. In 2019 it was Mercedes with Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas. In 2020 it was Mercedes with Lewis Hamilton, Valtteri Bottas and George Russell, who drove for Mercedes for one race when Lewis had COVID. And then in 2021 it was Mercedes with Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas, although that was the year that Lewis did not get his World Drivers' Championship, but he was very close. And then in 2022 it was Red Bull with Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez. In 23 it was Red Bull with Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez, and in 2024 it was McLaren with Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri. And in 2005, unless something goes completely upside down and through down a pipe and into a river, McLaren will be 2025 world champions yet again, as they are over 300 points ahead. So I'm surprised that they still haven't received it yet, but I'm not good at maths. So let's go on to talk about how many championships each team has had over the last 75 years. So there have been 75 years of the world champions. There have been fewer than that of world constructors champions. But how many constructors have won this? So from the bottom to the top, it was Brawn with one win in 2009, it was Benetton with one win in 95, it was Tyrrell with one win in 71, it was Matra with one win in 1969, it was BRM with one win in 1962, it was Van Wall with one win in 58, then it was Renault with 2 wins in 2005 and 2006, then it was Brabham with 2 wins in 66 and 67, it was Cooper with 2 wins in 59 and 60, it was Red Bull with 6 wins in 10, 11, 12, 13, 22 and 23, Lotus with 7 wins in 63, 65, 68, 70, 72, 73 and 78, Mercedes with 8 wins, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 and 21, and then it was McLaren with 9 wins in 74, 84, 85, 89, 88, 90, 91, 98 and 2024. It was Williams with 9 wins as well in 80, 81, 86, 87, 92, 93, 94, 96 and 97. And then Ferrari, because they have been in the sport for the longest of times, with 16 wins overall in 61, 64, 75, 76, 77, 79, 82, 83, 99, 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, 2007 and 2008. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Formula Amateur. Don't forget to check out my lovely colleagues on the Be The Change Media Network. Hopefully soon we'll have our formulaamateur.com website up and running, so stick around for that. There's no race this week, but next week we do have the Austin Grand Prix at the Circuit of the Americas, but before then we'll have yet another Saturday episode, so be prepared for that. I hope you have a lovely rest of your weekend and a lovely rest of your week, and I'll see you next Saturday. Goodbye.